Just a reminder, if you did miss a sermon or a period of history over the past few weeks, they are all available online on our YouTube page, which can be accessed through our website on our worship page or on our Bible study page. They all go to the same place. Many of you have been following along, and I'm sure many of you actually, and if you haven't, and this is your first time here, I will make these sheets available in one document at the end of the summer. But this is meant to be a timeline. How many of you have them taped across your living room wall? Yes, lots of hands here. All right, good job. I'll be doing home visits this week, so we've provided tape for those of you who need it. No, we want to continue on looking at the next few hundred years, and we are skipping a few hundred years at a time now. We're about 300 and some years. We're jumping ahead, and this is probably one of the darker periods of the church. And we'll talk. I'll hint on about some of the stuff that led up to it. But what happens over these next few centuries that we're looking at after the church split, it got kind of ugly for a bit. In that same emphasis, for those of you who weren't here last week, there was a 1054, there was a massive split between the East and the West Church. And as we talked about it, as much as it was guised as a theological difference, it actually boiled more down to power and controlling that power. And we're going to see that presence even more so in this few hundred-year period. By and large, though, as I mentioned last week, that Muhammad came on the scene and Islam was growing, and it has started to spread. It spread to northern Africa. It spread east towards India and towards the Middle East and the Persia area. And so as Muslims started to spread their expression of faith in Islam, they started to grow in number. And you can imagine with a fractured East and West church that became more challenging for them to actually have a presence. And so during that time and that period, although Gregory the Great gave them a pattern of Benedictine spirituality to follow and to guide, and we saw new monastic communities start to surface, in that period, other things happened too. And that was as those monastic communities embraced that spirituality over a period of about 500 years, monastic communities also started to decline in terms of their emphasis, and it actually became more centers of learning. And because the whole nation was Christian, and monastic centers and communities were the only place where people could really learn to read and write scriptures and study them, and it was one of the primary centers for intellectualism, rich and wealthy nobles would send their children to these monasteries, and they called them confrates. And what that meant was that they weren't really part of the monastic order, but they were there to help work. And over a period of from around 700 till the period we're looking at to about the 1200s, what you had is a lot of rich folks dropping their kids off at these monasteries, and then the kids did all the work. These young people did all the work. They would do the gardening and the dishes and the cooking and what that they thought, the monks thought that would give them more time to focus on prayer. And what we'll see in this period is, and it exemplifies a constant pattern throughout the history of the church, at every single time we have a monastic reform, it is not about bolstering up one's spirituality. It was actually about returning to physical labor. Benedict believed strongly in the idea that we work with our hands, and that prayer, ora in Latin, and labora, or labor in English, prayer and labor go hand in hand, and they're not one. If you neglect one over the other, then you forget your sense of well-being and what you're called to. And this really goes back to a biblical principle that when God placed the curse on Adam at the fall, he said, I'm cursing the ground, and you're going to have to work for the rest of your life, and you're going to have to cultivate food. And so part of Benedict's understanding was that curse has not been totally removed. And so to engage in the spiritual act of prayer without that handmaiden of work, then we have missed the point of the balance of how we're out to live out our calls. And so at several points, at 3 points exactly throughout this period we're looking at, we see the emergence of 3 different monastic communities that ultimately turn towards work or labor or some sort of ministry, as opposed to being cloistered in an abbey somewhere just praying. And I'm sure you'll recognize the names of those communities as we move forward. In 1071, you see at the bottom of your timeline, it goes from the bottom up, the Muslim Turks from Central Asia conquered Persia and advanced towards Constantinople. Now, what's interesting about this is Muslims and Christians and Jews were actually getting along okay. It wasn't great leading up to this period, leading up to 1071, and this is right after the split. But this is when we start to see violence in a real profound way enter into the religious landscape of Europe and the Middle East. And not to say that it hadn't existed before this, not to say that prior to the 1000s that there wasn't violence or there wasn't force. I think during that period where the church spread in the fifth period after it was legalized, I think that, made legal or made the state religion, that you probably had some military efforts there. But the Muslim Turks from Central Asia conquered Persia, and not necessarily just for political power, but for religious power. And it's very easy for us to say, oh, there goes the Muslims again. Boy, they're a violent crowd. They ran into the Twin Towers, and this is where it all started. And I think that that's our inclination, because so much of our cultural rhetoric right now is that Muslims are violent. But I think as we pause for a moment and look at this few hundred year period of the church, we'll discover that we were actually also participants in some pretty heinous things as Christians in the name of Jesus. It was 1073 that Gregory the Seventh started to, and this is seventh Gregory after that Gregory the First that instituted Benedictine spirituality in the 6th century. But Gregory the Seventh called for reform in the Holy Roman Empire. He rejected the selling of religious ecclesial offices and what is called investitures, which was that the Roman emperor could choose the Pope. In fact, so the Pope said, you don't get to say, this is almost the first sign of the separation of church and state in a Roman Empire. He said, you can't choose the Pope. That's an ecclesial matter. You're a state government, and although it's a Christian state, you can't choose to do that. You can't influence that. And that set the stage for a number of things. And I'll just go to name them. In 1201, we see a Pope, Innocent III. He claimed then the right to appoint government leaders, including the Holy Roman Emperor. So in a matter of about 100 and some years, you see this shift from the Pope rejecting this authority of the state and then claiming that authority, to the extent that the Pope was then in charge of choosing the emperor. And then another 100 years later, in 1302, the Pope declared named all secular rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. And it became, over a period of about 200 years, a shift in power from the state to the church. And you can start to see, if you start to think about it, if you know some of the challenges they had in the medieval period with the Western Church, this overreach had a profound effect, and I think in part is what led up to the Reformation. And I think perhaps had that Western Latin Church had not tried to grab so much power, we might not have seen the Reformation come out when it did. It was around 1096, I'm going to get all these dates right today, 1096, that Pope Urban II called for volunteers to fight the Turks because they had taken over the Holy Land, and they had occupied it, and Christians and Jews were facing challenges living in Jerusalem, and the Turks had taken over Constantinople, which is in today's Turkey. And all through this Byzantine Eastern Empire, you had this Muslim movement basically making Islam the national religion unofficially. But he called for folks to defend the Eastern Church because the Eastern Church realized they couldn't do it themselves. So when they appealed to the Pope's authority in 1097, 70,000 embarked on the First Crusade. And this wasn't like, hey, let's grab your swords and your shields and your spears and let's go slaughter people. But the thing is they called to defend the Holy Land. They called the people in to defend Constantinople and the Eastern Church. And in an empire that it felt like this was just what it was. There was no other alternative view. And promises were made to those who volunteered that they would receive gifts of loot and booty, I guess a pirate thing, I think, gifts of loot and money, and then they would also begin promising spiritual rewards. They would have a special place in heaven. They would have special dispensations. So 70,000 was the largest draft probably at the time, came together, and they went out on their first crusade, and they marched to Constantinople and Jerusalem, and they slaughtered folks along the way who stood in their way. A lot of Jews and a lot of women and a lot of children were killed during this period. Now, this first crusade was probably the most effective, and there were 9, in fact, in total, that were missions that were sent out, and none of them really accomplished what they hoped to accomplish. And in many times, even after that, outside of the city of Jerusalem, the work that the Crusaders did fell aside. But the major ones that came after that were in 1146, 1189, 1202, 1212, and 1217. Those were the major ones. And one of them, even in 1212, included a group of children that were led by children, and I would imagine younger kids and teenagers, and again, the different view of young people at the time. But they made their way all the way through Germany down to the Mediterranean. And the thought was the belief was is that when they got there, the seas would open up and they would be able to cross over to Israel. But it didn't happen, and in fact, they were captured, and we were put on a boat with the promise of being taken to Israel, or to over to where they needed to go. But instead, they were sold into slavery, and many of them died and drowned, all in the name of the church. All that's to say is there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands killed in the name of Christ during this few hundred-year period. And not a lot of people like to look back and reflect upon what actually happened in those crusades. They raped, they pillaged, and you say, how could they do that? Well, the fact of the matter is, in a state religion, oftentimes those who participate in that life aren't doing so because they are doing it out of a personal conviction or faith in Jesus Christ. They're doing it out of it because there was something that was promised to them. And so they went out and they did what they understood, and those were barbaric times. So whether you are Muslim, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, we are all guilty of violence in the name of our God. And some of you might say, well, I didn't have anything to do with that, and I would never do that today, and that's fine and dandy. I agree. None of us would ever take that upon. But it is important for us to remember, before we criticize other religions of having violence in their expression or in their efforts to proselytize nations, that we too are guilty of this sin as a people. And in fact, much of the understanding of who we are as a church emerged out of that time in a way that shaped the next several hundred years. And that violence didn't stop. It was a much smaller level, but we see even in the Protestant Reformation, you see people being burned at the stake. There was violence characterizing the Christian church all the way up to the last atrocity of the last century when we see the Holocaust. These were Christian efforts. And I guess my hope in that, and why this is a dark period, and what I want us as a community to understand is we are not guilty, or we are not free of the guilt of that sin. And acknowledging it keeps us in a different relationship with those who might say, oh, well, the Muslims do this or that in this day and age. Well, just let's remember that we too have sins that we are ashamed of. In 1115, I'm trying to do this right. Actually, in 1099, Jerusalem was ultimately captured. And many Muslims were massacred. The Jews, the Christians captured the holy city and reestablished it as a safe place to make a pilgrimage. About 20 or so years later, a guy named Bernard, founded a monastery in a town called Clairvaux, and he returned to an emphasis on labor and on prayer, but also out of that, still being influenced by the time and the tenor of the time. In 1129, he also developed the Knights of the Templar. Have you ever heard of those? Our movies like to talk about them. They were a religious holy order that came out of a monastic community. It was their job to defend Jerusalem from the infidels. And then about 200 years, 800 years later, in 1201, That's when Pope Innocent claimed that right to sort of make those appointments, and that was a reach for power. And part of Bernard of Clairvaux's desire was to avoid the entrapments of the government. And if you've ever heard of the Cistercian community, the monastic community, the Cistercians, this is where they date back their history to. Also in that same vein, in 1209, St. Francis of Assisi, or I like to say Francis was a sissy, but no one ever thinks that's funny, but thanks for laughing. He gave away, he was a nobleman who gave away all of his wealth, and he formed a group of traveling preachers that went out and basically ministered to the poor and preached, and that was a part of their work and their labor, and they defined themselves by that. So if you've heard of the monastic group, the Franciscans, this is where they get their origin. During a time when the church was grabbing for power, they responded with nonviolence, with ministry to the poor, and with work. Moving on, in 1216, the Dominican order in France formed, and it eventually moved to Spain, where it found its fullest roots. They were dedicated to work and learning and education and preaching, much like the Franciscans. And all that's to say, in this period where the church was grabbing for power, you have three major figures, Dominic, Francis, and Bernard, who set out and established these monastic communities based on the idea of ministry and service rather than power and dominance. And today they still influence people's spirituality in our present times. It was around 1255 that we see the beginning of what we'll talk about next week, which is a period called scholasticism in the church, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It was a period where the intellectual prowess of European thinkers began to rise. And in part that was due to the fact that there were people being educated. Literacy was slowly beginning to rise. And it was around that time that a guy named Thomas Aquinas, or St. Aquinas, wrote something called the Summa Theologia, and it is the most influential medieval document that we have today. It was the fullest treatment of Christian theology that the church had seen, outlining all of the heresies and addressing all those things that the church had faced for the last 1,000 years to 1,200 years. So if you're ever looking back to a period and you want to understand Orthodox doctrine, Aquinas' Summa is often what it's called, was the primary document. During this time, now that the East was liberated, they started to rebuild power. They were no longer in the shadow of the West, and those in the Byzantine Empire had rebuilt their cities and their churches, and were back in full form. And it was at 1274 that the Western Church called for the Second Council of Lyon in France. And one of the main emphases was, we want to unify the Eastern and Western churches. But it was a matter of fact that the patriarch in charge of the East was not thrilled with the Western Pope, felt like he was overreaching, and said, it's not going to happen. And so the East and the West split continued, and for many historians, this was kind of the final effort. Although that they made one in the last century, in 1965, they made record efforts towards reconciliation. This was the last major effort towards reconciling the East and the West, and we remained in a divided empire. As I said earlier, in 1302, the Pope declared all secular rulers could be appointed by him and by his authority. By 1309, the Pope of that time moved to France, disseating himself from Rome, the sort of headquarters of the church, and he moved to Avignon, France, and lived there for 70 years. And began ruling from that. And this was a huge problem for those in the Roman Empire as a whole, because they felt like they had a pope that was pandering to the French, and it was a problem for many. And it ultimately led to that pope and that regime being accused of what happened in 1348, which is the Black Death or the bubonic plague. And it's often forgotten that it killed about 40 million Europeans. That's about 33% of the population of Europe at the time. And we don't really think often about that, what that means and its significance. And I know we look back at COVID and we like, so many died, but let's put that into perspective of thinking 40 million people died. A third of the population of the continent were gone. That means that was a loss of power, a deconstruction of authority, a question of what the future held. And this sent people into a place where they began to question not only the Pope's authority, but the society's place as a whole in guiding their lives. And many blamed the bubonic plague on the Jews, on immorality, but specifically on the Pope who was living in Avignon. And that kind of ends our tour today. Previewing what's happening next week is the Gutenberg press was invented about a century later, and that's not to say that there weren't books and things available to folks, but in general, up to this point, it was a largely illiterate culture. Outside of those nobility and their children and the monastic communities and those within higher realms of the church, most people didn't know how to read and write beyond a basic level, if that. And it was the invention of the printing press that came about during this upcoming period of scholasticism that lasts all the way up into the Reformation that actually set the stage for a rebellion against the Western Church. And I can't help but think back at that those reformers looked and thought, for the last 500 years, the East and the West Church have fragmented. What is to stop us? And as the Pope grabbed for more authority and started selling indulgences and started using the power that he had in order to raise money to build St. Peter's and other great edifices of Europe, that there are those who said, this doesn't feel right. And this is a general reminder that in the Christian church, we are in a constant place of renewal. As I shared the very first week of this series, every 500 years, we have a rummage sale in the church, and we figure out what belongs and what doesn't. And it may not surprise you as you look around in our own ecclesial culture, our own culture of the church of this country, that we are experimenting and exploring and testing the boundaries of what it means to be the church today. We are in that period, which is even why it's more important for us to reflect back on 2,000 years of the church and say, where have we been and how might we make steps forward expressing our faith, relying and keeping in mind the orthodox place that the church has been, and also that we are in a time and place of change and difference. And today, as we close off this lesson in church history, I would invite you now to take that handout that you have, and we're going to sing actually a song that was written by Bernard of Clairvaux of the Cistercians in the 12th century. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is O Sacred Head, Now Wounded. It's a hymn that deals with the crucifixion and the parts of Christ's body that suffered. So now let us stand together and sing this blessed hymn, O Sacred Head, Now Wounded, from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux.